Go ahead in the back.
I understand that Ave Maria is going to stop offering health care to its employees. Will they be able to get away with that?
So, and they're not alone. There's a number of universities that are going at this in different ways. Some are actively suing the government over this. Others are going to sort of continue on the path that they're on and let the government come after them. Because when there's a lawsuit, there has to be a violation, and then there has to be damages that flow from the violation. In this context, if the organization doesn't provide the health care, and that's deemed to violate Obamacare, because keep in mind this is against the backdrop now of a piece of legislation that says that all employers have to provide health insurance, and that all health insurance has to have this type of coverage. So it's sort of a two-step process. If an organization decides not to provide health care to its workers, then there are certain fines that are associated with that. If they don't provide certain type of coverage, then there are fines associated with that as well.
Are these large fines?
Without question, yeah. As Peter alluded to, they're really the largest fines that the law has really ever doled out in this size and shape of legislation. I think there's a $10 million price tag or something associated with the University of Notre Dame's provision of health insurance. The fine is like $10 million.
This fellow had a
We're
question.
talking about the federal government. And I'm asking, what is the role of Congress in all of this? You talked a little bit about that, but it sounds like the president is making all the decisions with HHS. But Congress isn't involved.
Well, Congress, there is something that's been introduced by Congressman Roy Blunt out of Missouri, I think it is. And so there is legislation that would put a stop to this. Very likely this is going to end up in court, as you heard from that question and from Brian's answer. Here's my concern, though. This is something we need to think about. In all likelihood, and you can never really predict what the courts are going to do, they surprise you all the time, but in all likelihood, we have every reason to believe that we're going to win this in court, that this will go down. It ought to make us all very concerned that there's a lack of outrage out there in the country, that we were not able to pass the Blunt Amendment in the U.S. Senate. Because here's what you have to think about. If the court is the only thing that's protecting us, these judges, they'll never admit it, but these judges are formed by the culture as much as anyone else is. If the court's the only thing protecting us, that means we have a good 20 years or so until new judges come along, formed by a darker culture, that come back and overturn this. There was a decision in the 1980s, Bowers v. Hardwick, that was a gay rights law, and the judges at that time said, well, there is no right to homosexual sodomy in the U.S. Constitution. It only took 17 years. In 2003, when Lawrence v. Texas, in a different court said, we change our mind, there is. The judges are formed by the culture too. And it should really concern us greatly. It should alarm us, and that's why we should all be doing what we can politically and in terms of education, in terms of talking to our neighbors, our coworkers, because if the culture doesn't protect us, if the only thing protecting us is the law, and the culture no longer understands the importance of the First Amendment, even if we win in court, it's only good for about 20 years.
Would this going to the Supreme Court now, where they're going to force people to purchase insurance as an individual or be fined? Would that have any effect on this situation?
Oh, without question. So the HHS mandate gets its teeth from the Obamacare piece of legislation as a whole. And that piece of legislation has been challenged, and oral arguments have actually been scheduled. There's 3 days of, I want to say 2 hours a day of arguments that have been scheduled for March of this year. Is that right? It's in March, right? Yeah. So those oral arguments will be taking place, and a decision is actually expected before the November election on the constitutionality of Obamacare as a whole, as the entire piece of legislation.
Have the bishops, or do you know, have the bishops decided how they're going to respond to this? I mean, in terms of you know, the institutions that are going to be charged with paying for this service?
Their most recent public statements strongly imply that a lawsuit is forthcoming. They haven't said that explicitly, but it's strongly implied.
What if they just said, we're not gonna do this? We're just not gonna do it, no lawsuit, I mean, and like you say, wait for the government. I mean, if every Catholic institution in the country
Yeah.
said, we're not doing this, you know?
So,
What can the government do?
I think the public reports on this are that, you know, by the thousands really, there are IRS divisions, agents that are being hired and trained. Now, I don't know where that process is, I'm not on the inside. It's sad that we have to have a conversation like that.
Yeah.
That should, you would think, be all transparent. But I would make no mistake that these fines will be enforced one way or another. And I think if you look at the federal budget studies on Obamacare, the idea is that these things get paid for one way or another through the federal budget. So-
Mary Lou.
Could you comment just on the power that would be given to the executive branch if this particular mandate does pass, in terms of the future?
But it's tremendous. I mean, Brian might want to speak to this too, but this is part of the danger of this this legislation that has passed, is that the director, what is she? The Secretary of Health and Human Services, she has almost just near total power to decide what Obamacare means. She can decide that it means that Catholic institutions will have to provide and pay for abortion-inducing drugs. If she wants to, she can decide that it means that the Catholic Church will pay for surgical abortions, for assisted suicide. All you gotta do is redefine a particular Catholic institution as not religious, and redefine religious services, healthcare services, as including surgical abortions, as including assisted suicide. There really is no logical end to what the HHS secretary can do. This was the fight that the bishops were having when the other side, when the people in favor of Obamacare a couple of years ago said, what are you talking about that this will require you to pay for abortions? There's nothing that states that explicitly in Obamacare. And everybody on the pro-life side pointed to that incredible power that is being granted to the HHS secretary. And we're now seeing this played out. This is part of why within the church, Catholics who are known traditionally as liberals or dissenters, why even they were so outraged by the initial HHS mandate, because it kind of exposed them as patsies, as, you know, the folks on our side, everything we said just turned out to be true. And so that's why they needed the fig leaf of the accommodation. But that's the danger. I don't know.
Well, I would just follow that with that you know, our position on this is not really even an anti-Obama position. It's really what you need to speak to with your friends and people may not be with you or with us on issues like contraception or abortion. That's not what this is about. And if you know, there are people who, if you said to them, we're going to give, you know, George W. Bush all of the power that you just gave to President Obama, you know, they would shudder to think, because they don't, you know, they have a different political persuasion. Or think of future presidents who might come from all kinds of backgrounds, that they now have the power to do these kinds of things based on what that particular administration thinks is a good idea. So that's something that we need to be debating and putting out there for people to understand that this is not about that we don't approve of President Obama. That's not the case at all. It's that we don't want this kind of power consolidated the way it's been consolidated and then used against the Catholic Church or against another people of faith in, frankly, a blatantly discriminatory way.
I know you have
Well,
another
I'm
question.
confused, because a couple of weeks ago, they said there had been a great compromise over this. The Catholic institutions, hospitals, universities, don't have to pay for abortions, but the healthcare provider will do it for their employees. but the hospital or the Catholic institution won't be charged in their healthcare policy for it. So
But-
how is that gonna,
If they can redefine words like healthcare and religious institution and marriage, then I guess they can redefine the word compromise too. I mean, a compromise is what happens when two sides agree to something. And there was no compromise on the part of the Catholic institutions. Like I said, they didn't even talk to the bishops. All they did was tweak the original mandate a little. Even they didn't use compromise, they called it an accommodation. They just tweaked it a little and said, okay, what we'll do is instead of requiring the institutions to pay for it directly, we'll require the insurance companies to give it for free. And of course, if you know anything about how insurance works, that was just, I think people all through the Hartford area must have been laughing because, obviously they're gonna pass off the cost to the premiums. Nothing's free, and these institutions will still have to pay for it through their premiums.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that is if it were truly free, or as some have argued, if it's actually more profitable to give free contraception, then don't you think the companies would offer it already?
Yeah.
If it would increase their profit margin or somehow be free, they all compete with each other, so one would give it, then the other would give it, so that they could compete. I mean, I think we all know that that contraception is very costly to a hospital, to an insurance carrier. Some of these are very sophisticated procedures that require the use of an operating room. I don't think the use of an operating room is free. Last I checked. Yeah, here's a new.
Yes.
One of the earlier questions sort of approached the idea of, at the level of the Conference of Bishops, taking a civil disobedience approach to this issue. And I'd like to sort of turn that around and towards the individual for a moment and ask, when does civil disobedience become a practical, possible, or even a necessary action for individuals? Because, right now, the mandate applies that all Americans must have health insurance, and all insurance plans must cover these objectionable services. And it's been said to me directly that, you in particular, you get health care from your employer pays the full premium, so you're really not involved in this, and somehow I have trouble taking comfort from that fact. So just to reiterate the question, when does this become a practical or necessary option for the individual to civilly disobey?
That's a question that we need to be thinking about, and I can't give you a solid answer tonight, like that moment it will be crossed at such and such a time when such and such a thing happens, but you're not at all wrong. In fact, you're very much on the right track to raise the question and to put the question out there tonight. I talked about the Blunt Amendment, which would have stopped the HHS mandate. This was, it failed in the US Senate. Very, very interesting. We have two US senators. Senator Blumenthal gave really a boilerplate answer for why he voted down the Blunt Amendment. Senator Lieberman, as he always is, Senator Lieberman was the interesting one. Lieberman voted down the Blunt Amendment. He said he disagrees with the HHS mandate. He even disagrees with the so-called accommodation. He says it falls short. But he voted down the Blunt Amendment because he felt that the language went too far. And this goes directly to Tim's question. Lieberman left the impression that if you had a watered-down Blunt Amendment that only addressed the religious institutions, which is what the bulk of our talk has been about tonight, but of course it's not only about that. If you had a watered-down Blunt Amendment that only protected religious institutions, but left Joe secular employer guy who's, he gets his health care from his car wash business or his law firm or whatever, if you leave him out in the cold and he's still forced to provide, to pay for and provide abortion-inducing drugs, then Senator Lieberman might vote for it. Cut that guy off from the religious institutions. That's the impression that Lieberman gave. And the bishops, although a lot of the focus has been on religious institutions, the bishops actually are fighting for the rights of all of us, not just the people that work for Catholic institutions, but the Blunt Amendment, and this is why we lost Lieberman's vote, the original Blunt Amendment was fighting for precisely what Tim is talking about, so that we don't have to reach that point where we have to ask that question about, is it time for civil disobedience? Because none of us as individuals, Catholics or folks of other religious faiths, should be required by the federal government to provide and pay for things that go directly counter to our beliefs. This is huge. We're focused on the religious institutions, but it's not really just the institutions, it's all of us. That's how big this thing is. And we may reach a point, I mean, if Senator Lieberman gets his way, and there's some other version of the Blunt Amendment that goes through, then that question may be one that we have to revisit. Is that fair? Is there anything you want to add?
The only thing I would add to that is the idea that if the insurance is a condition of your employment, then it doesn't matter whether the employer is putting money in your check and then you're giving money for the insurance, or the money never makes your check because the employer funds the policy directly. That doesn't matter. So the moral question that you're raising about how far do we go in participating in some of these things shouldn't turn on whether it's you paying the premium or the employer paying the premium. What the government has done is said, all employers, okay, so no longer can you go and negotiate with your prospective employer, or maybe negotiate with two employers against each other. You can no longer rely on your talents and what you bring to the table to try to advocate that the employer either pay for this stuff or not. Now it's the government who's told both employers they will pay for this, and what portion of it you pay for directly, you can still negotiate that, but somebody's going to pay for this. And the way it gets paid for is you get up every day and go to work, and you do something for 8 or 9 or 10 hours a day, whatever it is, and it's your sweat and toil which then pays for these things which are morally objectionable to you, and that's why it's a matter of civil disobedience. And this is something that the church will have to address as well. I mean, we all need spiritual direction, informing our consciences and in living them out consistent with what we believe. So, I mean, myself, I'll be looking to my own pastor, to my bishop. You have to study, we will all have to struggle with this together. And that's why it's a violation of the First Amendment, because the government is not supposed to make any laws that infringe on your and my ability to practice our faith. And so if we're having to stay up nights wondering whether we should go to work tomorrow because of what our work is creating, then clearly that's an infringement.
As part of Obamacare, won't there be medical panels sponsored by the government involved in how services are distributed, how they're rationed, and be involved in end-of-life decisions?
Without question. So redefining what is healthcare, I'll say on the front end, at the beginning of life, redefining what is healthcare in that context is no different than redefining what is healthcare, at the end of the tracks as well. So we have friends that are involved in hospice care who provide pain treatment to people who have terminal illnesses. As soon as Health and Human Services starts defining what is healthcare, then they can start defining how much morphine is given in certain situations, or what kind of hospice care is being given, what kind of assisted suicide is being provided. So all of that is certainly fair game, I think, as soon as we go down this road.
Especially since we don't know how much it's going to cost yet either.
Well, if contraception saves money, think about how much money assisted suicide saves. Okay, so.
One last question about the legal system. Two organizations I know of, like Priests for Life and EWTN, and the lawyers are on the other night from the Beckett Fund. Now, they start their lawsuits, and the more the merrier. Do they help put the brakes on this, or no? You know what I mean?
Only if they win.
Oh, okay. So just by the fact they enter a lawsuit doesn't mean that they have to.
Well, you can, in federal court, you can move for an injunction,
Oh,
or
yes,
you can move to have some sort of stay put on the enforcement of the law as to you.
Right.
And then other people can argue that stay applies to them by analogy. But the amount of resources and the amount of treasure and time that is spent by religious employers and people, even secular employers, to get to that, You know, I mean, as an attorney, attorneys make money,
Yeah.
but to have to fund a lawsuit like that just to get the injunction is already an infringement of the First Amendment. And so people have to, you know, they have to fight the good fight, of course, but they don't really get anything for their investment until they win.
All right, thank you.
Aren't there two deadlines here? One is the coming August 1st for agencies like Ave Maria and EWTN. Will have to comply with August 1st. And then January 1st, next January 1st, I think it's for the general Obama healthcare compliance. Will the courts act in time to provide relief before those deadlines?
I don't see that the courts can act in time to provide complete relief. So, you know, you're all familiar with open enrollment when employers choose which health insurance plan to go with. You know, employers today are talking to their health insurance companies, crafting next year's policies. And so the fact that this is going on now, you may hear, oh, well, no one's being hurt yet. This isn't even in force yet. Make no mistake, the Catholic institutions, the even secular employers, they're dealing with this already to come up with insurance offerings that they're going to put out to their employees, so that when open enrollment comes around next January, they have something to offer that comports with these provisions. So people are already spending their time and their treasure having their First Amendment rights trampled on today. It's happening now.
Are there any of these insurance companies that are maybe against all of this and don't want to provide some of these services as well? You don't hear of them.
I can't speak to that. I do not know.
They've grumbled. That's, I mean, there was an article, there's an online news magazine here in Connecticut called the Connecticut Mirror, ctmirror.org, and you can go and read the article there. After the accommodation came out, for some reason, the mainstream media didn't bother to ask the insurance companies here in Hartford, but CT Mirror did. And the insurance companies were a bit put off. I mean, the Obama administration didn't consult them before they came up with this so-called accommodation and said, oh, okay, we'll just require the insurance companies to provide contraception for free.
Yeah, it raises another misnomer, which is they want to ignore that most of these Catholic institutions are actually self-insurers.
Right.
So they may have a third-party administrator. So I don't want to name any, but the Aetna may administrate a plan on behalf of the St. Francis employees' health plan. And so the employer directly defines what the set of benefits is that its employers get. And the Aetna has all of the telephone banks and the computer systems and the billing procedures to run the plan. But the insurer is the Catholic institution. They are the actual insurer. And they tell the third-party administrator how to run the program. So yeah, make no mistake, that's an insurance company that has written a plan, tried to put its mission into practice to provide health care to its employees, and is unable to do so because they've been told by the big government that you have to provide sterilization, abortion, and contraception, etc.
And typically states that do have, I mean, there are, on the state level, some states did have contraceptive mandates, but the churches, the institutions, religious institutions, usually got out of that by self-insuring, which is now an avenue that's been cut off by the HHS mandate. My wife is a former attorney for the State Department of Insurance here in Connecticut, and she had an op-ed in the Hartford Courant about a month ago laying out the accommodation. If you pick up one of the packets, you'll see a photocopy of that article.